Hi, everyone. Welcome to another confined edition of the France 24 debate. I'm François Picard. As the United States records a record number of fatalities in a single day, as Germany announces it may post a 10% drop in its economy in the second quarter, China is reopening and revving up. The latest tangible sign, the city of Wuhan, the initial epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak, reopening after 76 days, after major blunders at the outset. Has China rebounded to the point where it could even dethrone the United States as the go-to superpower in a crisis? With us to talk about it, Eric Olander, managing editor of the China Africa Report. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Linda Yueh, her latest book, The Great Economists, is with us from England. Welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be here.
And Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Thanks for being with us, Judah.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, 76 days in lockdown, those barriers removed from Wuhan. It's a report by Brian Quinn.
The city of Wuhan, China, counting down not to a new year, but to the end of 77 days under lockdown. To mark the occasion, a light show on both sides of the Yangtze River, with images of health workers who helped fight the coronavirus epidemic projected onto the city's skyscrapers. As the clock struck midnight Tuesday, the makeshift barriers that had enclosed the city were removed, allowing outbound movement to resume. Thousands of passengers flocked to airports and train stations, hoping to catch the first transport out of Wuhan after months without having seen their friends and family.
解封嘛，解封了之后肯定走的人会比较多。然后，所以，就提前就今天晚上就走吧，就是刚好到8号啊。
The city's 11 million residents are now free to travel if approved by a government phone app that evaluates their contagion risk. Life is far from back to normal in a city that is certain to remain scarred by the outbreak for a long time to come. Schools remain closed. Residents are still expected to wear masks in public, limit their outings, and avoid large gatherings, as dozens of new asymptomatic cases of coronavirus have been detected there in recent days. The official death toll in Wuhan stands at over 2,500. Experts, though, believe the real number is likely far higher. Chinese officials remain vigilant, fearing a second outbreak sparked by asymptomatic cases and infected citizens returning from abroad.
Eric Olander, your reaction, as we heard in that report, it's too early in Wuhan to pop open the champagne. Nonetheless, has China rebounded?
Well, certainly it looks that way, but I think Brian's report really left at the end the questions that we just don't know. Those asymptomatic data isn't in there. I keep coming back to when President George W. Bush was on the deck of the aircraft carrier, the Abraham Lincoln, with that mission accomplished sign behind him, declaring that, the United States had won the war in Iraq. And it was premature then. And, the Chinese are running the risk that they are celebrating a little bit too early. And I think there's reason for everybody to be concerned that this thing doesn't come back again, especially now that people are starting to move in China.
Are they celebrating?
They definitely are celebrating. I mean, it's very, very clear. And I follow the messaging that China does in Africa, and they are saying that they've conquered this thing and they are getting back. And this is all part of the broader narrative that they're trying to put out, to say that this is a technocratic government that that saw this challenge and overcame the challenge, delivering both for their own people, but also showing the merits of the Communist Party, both domestically and internationally as well. So I think they are definitely doing a victory lap.
Linda Yueh, when we revisit those initial blunders, the messaging blunders, as Eric Olander says, we criticize China for being too top-down, too authoritarian. Now, though, this way of handling things at this point in the crisis, is this the right way to be going about it?
I think there's always going to be some concern about whether or not the Chinese can really lock down and not expect sort of a kind of, eruption of people wanting to go back into shop. And I think we're going to see that pretty much in every economy. I think what they'll have to be very careful about, and I think this is where I would share the concerns that have been expressed, and we're going to also again face this in other economies, is whether or not you can really prevent a second outbreak of COVID-19. If you look at countries like Singapore, Japan, South Korea, it's quite clear that until there's a vaccine, there's going to be a resurgence of the need for social distancing, if not another lockdown. And I think that's where the messaging really has to take into account, I think, just the fact that we just don't know what is happening scientifically, medically with this virus. But again, there's no reason why, if you were to end a lockdown, and it's been a really dramatic lockdown for quite some time, that people wouldn't want to resume, some of their normal activities. And Apple stores, as you know, has actually reopened in China. So they're expecting people to be back on the street. But again, all the medical experts say until there's a vaccine, it's very likely there is no real way of preventing another outbreak.
Yeah, we're recording this ahead of a speech in which the French president's expected to extend the lockdown here in France. We don't know when the lockdown will end in Lombardy. We don't know when it will end where you are, Linda, in the UK. 76 days for Wuhan. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that's quite a long time. But if you look at the initial lockdown period for quite a number of European countries, 3 weeks or so, and it's been extended, I think that's probably not an unrealistic time to be thinking about the initial lockdown. So the reason why I say it's initial lockdown is because if you listen to some of the medical experts, the epidemiologists, they would say probably it'll take around 12 weeks to really get over what they consider to be the part of the virus, the crisis, the pandemic that could cause hospitals to become overwhelmed. So we don't really know how long an appropriate period of lockdown is, but I know that in the UK, they're looking at two things. One is the stabilization of cases. Some say they ought to be looking more at death rates, and the second part is the capacity of the national health system. So, I don't think any country thinks 3 weeks at this point in the initial lockdown is enough. We may be entering a period, by the way, of periodic lockdowns, more of a relaxation, practicing just social distancing, maybe on a looser basis over the next possibly 12 to 18 months.
Judah Grunstein, one of the keys in the report we saw was the idea that you can venture out of Wuhan, but you have to have on your phone an app that gives you the green light. I know they're working on such an app here in France. They may even roll it out before the end of the month. But overall, would you say China is better equipped for developing an exit strategy than we are here in the West?
Well, I think that this question of what kind of regime is best equipped to handle both the crisis and the exit strategy from the crisis, I think just with regard to China, for instance, no one in China, I think, has any illusion that the Communist Party handled the initial outbreak of the crisis well. And I think that to the extent that the Communist Party did actually follow up with these draconian measures as an authoritarian regime, they're very well placed to do that kind of response. I think that where you have an advantage in democratic societies is that as chaotic as their initial responses to the crisis, and again, I think it's important to say that chaos was not necessarily any better than the Chinese response of organized repression of the facts coming out. But the chaos that you see in the democratic societies obviously puts them at a disadvantage in terms of that initial response. But everything that I've been reading from the people that I trust the most in terms of epidemiology, but also the politics of this, is that the most important factor, both for handling the crisis and for an exit strategy, is trust and legitimacy between governments and their populations. And that kind of trust in this kind of crisis only comes from transparency, a real adherence to getting the facts, correcting errors, correcting the record when errors have been made, acknowledging that there's a lot of uncertainty, and being very transparent. To the extent that a real example of this in the U.S. is the New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo, who I think their initial handling in New York State of the crisis could be criticized. But in terms of his subsequent handling, in terms of the transparency of his press conferences, in terms of the strict adherence to facts, not avoiding the very hard truths that need to be said in terms of the suffering that's going to take place, but also trying to really encourage resilience and courage. He's been identified as a real example of that. I don't think in any of those areas the Chinese regime is well placed. So to the extent that they're opening up Wuhan, and to the extent that they were well placed to impose those kind of draconian measures that allow them to do it now, yes. But again, there's all these question marks that we've already mentioned on, and those, should there be a resurgence, we'll see how well, or the degree of trust there is between the Chinese population and the Communist Party at that point.
Eric Olander, we interviewed the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone a few days ago, and she compared with the experience of the Ebola outbreak. And that issue that Judah Grunstein just brought up, trust, she says, is very important. In your messaging, people have to believe what you're saying. Do the Chinese believe what their authorities are saying?
I tend to find that public support of the party in China tends to run, and this is anecdotal, I don't have data to support this, much higher than, say, public support of the government in the United States does. Certainly of the federal government. I think Judah's right that saying that the state governors have done a very good job, but pretty much everything that you talk about in terms of trust, consistency, transparency, correcting the facts, is not what the national leadership in the United States is doing. And that's not whataboutism. That is just a fact as it is. And so I think the Chinese, when they're seeing what's happening in places like Italy, Spain, the United States, and they look at their government, and from what I'm seeing and the people that I speak with, and I've lived there for more than a decade, generally speaking, the guy on the street sees, he likes what he sees for the most part. Yes, they are very much opposed to the corruption and there's a lot of problems in China. But in terms of their handling of crises like this, I tend to think that public opinion is on the side of the party.
Linda, you agree?
And I don't follow the public opinion in China. I don't have any sense of that. I think at the moment, there is certainly a feeling that the tensions around information in terms of COVID-19 is an issue. So in other words, if there is another outbreak, which I think we all think there will be, according to the epidemiologists, is that really because it's imported cases? And I'm sure some of it is, but I think there's quite a lot of, I would say, tension around that. And I think one of the challenges with this pandemic in particular is the extent to which officials want to share knowledge. So you see that, for instance, here in the UK, where there's a slight hesitation with maybe setting out uncertain information about when the lockdown might end, or when there might be a recurrence, or when there's a vaccine, when there's antibody tests. And the chief medical officer here has said they don't want to detract from people adhering to lockdown rules. So I imagine there'll be very similar discussions in China, in America, and elsewhere around the extent to which the public message needs to focus on what people need to do. But I think there's also a very legitimate case in China and elsewhere for actually just setting out realistically what the timeline is, what we know, what we don't know. And I think that's easier to do in a democratic system with a free press, which constantly asks these sorts of questions.
All right, so there's how you tailor your message to your domestic audience. And then, of course, there's the messaging for abroad. And what we have seen is that China has turned a soft power own goal into, at least on the day we're speaking here in early April, into something of a victory. We've seen in the last couple of weeks the term face mask diplomacy begin to emerge. It's a report by France 24's Beijing correspondent Charles Pellegrin.
西班牙1000个嘛是多少啊？20 It's a rare commodity in Europe, but plenty can be found in China.
这个7个箱子里面一共有2万个口罩，这个都是那个医用口罩，就是一般的医用口罩，因为它医用口罩要分好几个种类，
This Shanghai workshop generally makes glasses for a French brand. But for a week now, Jiang Li has been stocking up masks built in eastern China. In a few hours, he'll send them to Europe.
这个是去发到那个法国的穆鲁兹的，这个是巴黎的，一个是意大利的，一个是西班牙的。
His boss, a Frenchman, decided to buy and donate them to hospitals that need them.
现在他们那个疫情很严重的情况下，应该是这个是正常的。包括现在国外都在抢口罩，把这个东西都像当宝贝一样的。
Since early April, China has been able to produce 200 million masks a day. It's the biggest producer on the planet, and it's getting orders from around the world. This changes the narrative for Beijing. China is now offering its assistance to the virus-hit countries of the world, while the mistakes of the early outbreak are behind them. Chinese media regularly broadcast reports on these shipments of masks overseas.
3月22号凌晨4点，一批由中国企业向非洲捐赠的防疫物资从广州白云国际机场出发，前往埃塞俄比亚博莱机场。
The masks in this aircraft aren't being sold. They're donations to Ethiopia from Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba and member of the Communist Party. The company has vowed to continue its efforts.
这批救援物资将使用近200架包机，将物资陆续运往亚洲、非洲、欧洲、美洲、大洋洲的100多个国家。
China is able to produce so many masks because all the factories in the country were mobilized to boost production. This was the case for oil giant Sinopec, as well as Foxconn, the electronics producer from Taiwan. In the south of the country, this auto manufacturer also transformed its production lines in February in order to start making masks. For health reasons, the factory did not let us visit the site, but we were granted a phone interview with an executive.
我们现在每天已经生产差不多200万只200万片口罩，我们是统一的给到政府。
Of the 30,000 workers on site, 2,000 are now working on mask production. The machines built here are now running at full speed.
首先能够为这场前面那个战争能够贡献自己的一份力量，我们认为非常的自豪也很骄傲，希望能够做更多的事情，能够帮助大家一起团结起来，把疫情给抗争过去。
For the Chinese government, mask diplomacy isn't just a way to improve relations with foreign countries. This historian believes it also serves domestic purposes.
Le gouvernement chinois, pour sa légitimité, a besoin vis de la Chine de dire deux choses. D'abord, la catastrophe frappe partout, et pas seulement en Chine. Et deuxièmement, la Chine est mieux armée que les autres, réagit mieux. Alors le thème, elle fait preuve de générosité, est plus ambigu, parce qu'en réalité, malgré l'immense production de masques, on a des sources, y compris des sources officielles, qui disent qu'il n'y a pas assez de masques en Chine.
In the case of a second wave of infections, will China continue to send masks to the entire planet? With a population of 1.5 billion, China would need to protect itself too.
Your reaction to that report, Judah Grunstein?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think that to the extent that, for instance, China reached out and offered aid to medical equipment and assistance to Italy in the beginning of its outbreak, there was that was sort of the beginning of this this theme of Chinese public diplomacy around humanitarian assistance and whether China would replace the United States, which historically we're more used to seeing playing that role when it comes to a natural catastrophe or other humanitarian aid. In the story, though, to my mind, the story has taken so many twists and turns in the meantime that it's really hard and dangerous to draw any conclusions at any one point, because subsequently there were some controversies over whether all of the equipment was donated or whether it was purchased. There were subsequently some problems in terms of quality control, I think in Spain and in Eastern Europe as well. So some of the masks were actually not used and were returned. And so I think that it's a very moving a story that's still got a lot of moving parts. I think also that you have to really take a lot of stuff with a grain of salt. This is essentially a hostage situation. There are countries around the world that are in desperate need of this assistance and this aid. And so they're going to accept it from China. They're going to thank China very publicly and show a lot of gratitude with good reason. At the same time, there's no illusions about why China is offering this aid, the sort of geopolitical strings that are attached, or the public diplomacy strings that are attached. It's the same in cases where the United States, for instance, or European countries have shown generosity in crises around the world. Countries accept aid gratefully. It might soften some of the rough edges in terms of perceptions and relations. In general, they continue to have a pretty realistic view of what's behind the aid, and it doesn't necessarily it doesn't align into the perception of a national government of China or the United States, for instance. So I think that the long-term impact of it, it's still a little premature to say clearly in terms of the optics. It's a very unsettling moment.
You say, Linda, I've seen memes going around on WhatsApp. And again, we saw in that report how they turned a car making factory or an eyeglass making factory into face mask making factories on a dime. I saw a meme on WhatsApp saying the Chinese say they're happy to rebuild the roof of Notre Dame for cocktail hour.
Well, I think there's been an offer to build HS2, which is the high-speed rail here in the UK as well. I think that is, as already been pointed out, one of the big differences between China and other economies here in Europe. There's sort of more of a, wanting companies to volunteer to change their production to help with specifically ventilators, because we know that's a key piece of medical equipment that's in short supply in a lot of countries. But in China, the ability to turn on a dime, as you say, and produce face masks, which are themselves not very technical pieces. So you can imagine most factories that are able to produce smartphones, covers could probably do that. And I think that is probably one of the differences, that in terms of China's, I suppose, message to the rest of the world, is that in their system, they can do this. But I would also probably just say this type of positioning between the US and China, we would expect to continue. This is just the latest phase of the competition between the two economic superpowers. And in fact, in the US, you already see the invocation of the Defense Act, which also allows the US government to essentially ask companies to produce things really that's needed for the pandemic. But as we've seen between the US and China, there's been, and this will go on, a lot of different fronts in which each are positioning themselves as being the best stakeholder in terms of in the world, in terms of helping with this pandemic. And China is actually doing more of it at this point than the United States, although of course the pandemic started in China. It was earlier in China, so they may have a little bit more space to do that. But one does wonder, in terms of the United States, where if they will also do some type of soft power messaging in due course.
It's the timeline of the pandemic. It's also the ability to manufacture. Eric Olander, since the beginning of this crisis, the French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, has said several times, when this is all done, we're going to have a serious rethink of the fact that we are so dependent on China for manufacturing of things in the healthcare industry, such as pharmaceuticals, such as face masks. Is China going to weigh more than ever on manufacturing when it's over? Or will that rethink turn to a return of industry here in Europe?
I mean, sitting here in Vietnam where I live, it's really laughable to think that they're going to manufacture masks in France. I mean, the cost of labor and insurance and all the union benefits and everything to make a product that is, worth 50 cents, 40 cents, it just isn't economically viable. So politically, I think that makes sense to say right now, just to make everybody feel better. But at the end of the day, the economics aren't going to be any different tomorrow than they were yesterday before the crisis, in terms of the cost of making the masks. Regarding the optics battle between the United States and China, I think there's a couple points to note here, because the optics are working on a bunch of different levels here. Number one, which was Jack Ma on March 16th first announced that he was going to make his big donation to Africa. On March 23rd, the planes landed in Addis Ababa, 7 days from the time he made his announcement. And the Chinese are demonstrating that they can get stuff done. One of the things that the Americans are doing now, the Americans have just doubled their aid by another $225 million, but they're having to route through multilateral organizations like the UN, the World Bank, and others. So in terms of gaining the credit for what the contributions are, the United States simply isn't getting it because you don't see on the ground planes, people, stuff. And in developing countries, places like Africa, the need to get stuff done fast is a particular urgency to it. And the optics of those planes landing filled, brimming over with PPE really goes to the second optics battle, which is they're being handed over to people like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, who they themselves are then taking credit for distributing this aid, which they badly need. So at the same time, the Chinese are building really good relationships with governing elites in places like Africa, and that is going to pay dividends for years, if not decades down the road.
And you say routing that aid through multilateral organizations in the case of the United States. Of course, the president himself has been pointing the finger at those multilateral organizations. On Monday, Donald Trump said that the World Health Organization was too China-centric, and even hinted that the U.S. could halt its aid to the Geneva-based UN organization altogether.
They called it wrong. They called it wrong. They missed the call. They could have called it months earlier. They would have known. And they should have known. And they probably did know. So we'll be looking into that very carefully. And we're going to put a hold on money spent to the WHO. We're going to put a very powerful hold on it, and we're going to see. It's a great thing if it works, but when they call every shot wrong, that's no good.
Judah Grunstein, is the U.S. really going to cut its aid to the WHO?
Well, Trump went on to back from those remarks. He denied that he actually said that they would suspend funding to the WHO, and then even further denied when it was pointed out to him that he had said it, that was what he said. With regard to the question of public message, but also multilateralism, this crisis is almost like a perfect storm for this administration. It's an administration that's hostile to multilateralism. It's an administration that has adopted a very transactional approach to relations with other countries on a bilateral level. And so when you have a crisis like this that requires on the bilateral level a degree of generosity, and on the multilateral level a degree of leadership, it's clearly a crisis that this administration is incapable of handling.
And yet, let me bring in Eric Olander on this, Donald Trump could still get reelected.
Oh, I think, anybody who knows the system right now in the United States, it's a 50-50 toss-up. I mean, if not, he's right now, his poll numbers are quite solid, all things being equal. So perceptions on the outside looking into the United States are very different from those on the inside. And domestically, I think he's quite strong. So definitely not out of the race in terms of U.S. politics. I think the WHO kind of messaging that he kind of came out with today was, again, in part about domestic politics and less about, in fact, the WHO, in my view. The Peter Navarro memo that came out that was revealed that said that the president had been informed in January And I think what he's trying to do, which has been a pattern for him from the beginning, is shift the blame away from him. He doesn't have responsibility. And by saying it was the WHO who didn't live up to their responsibility, he's trying to take attention away from that damning memo that said he was informed of potentially trillions of dollars of loss to the economy. And Peter Navarro laid out the scenario. Peter Navarro, of course, being a presidential advisor and a China hawk as well.
China hawk, Linda Yueh, who nonetheless, as Eric just said, has been advocating for a more forceful role from the federal government. Again, as we've said earlier in this conversation, the leading has come a lot from the states and not from the federal government in the United States. Again, very different from China.
Yes, I think quite a lot of especially if you look at which states have done lockdowns, President Trump has said it's actually up to the governors of those states. And I think this is really a function of in one sense, the very decentralized federal system of the United States, where obviously certain functions, including unemployment insurance, one of the key ways to help people, is largely done at the state level. Now, I think the whole the issue around whether or not at the federal government level they could be doing more, I think there is going to be quite a lot of questions that will continue to be asked over how prepared the United States could have been earlier, and obviously as part of the criticism of the WHO, there's a lot of dimensions of this, which isn't just around the WHO, but I think with how the WHO is managing the relationship between US and China, that will have an effect in terms of the being now in the line of fire amongst the international organizations the United States is voicing skepticism about. It would, of course, join the WTO, the UN as a whole. But if you look at the ways in which the United States at this point is still, of course, focused on America first. They're focused on Trump's re-election and within the government itself. And I think all of these things are going to generate quite a few headlines between now and November in terms of where the blame for preparedness, for information, for even calling what COVID-19 is going to sit. So I think we should expect more positioning, not less, and just bear in mind that
Can I just say, Linda, it's not just in the United States. A couple days back, there was a 2-page spread in the Daily Mail, the tabloid that sells the most where you are in the UK, saying China owes us 351 billion pounds. And it was based on an upcoming report by the conservative Henry Jackson Society think tank. And it says all these conservative MPs are blaming China for everything, basically. What's your reaction?
I think there's going to be quite a lot of this in the coming months as people essentially try, and there's always going to be a balance, I think, between those who would say, it is China's fault. This is where the pandemic started, the information they didn't give. And then I think there'll be others who are going to focus, and this is largely speaking what the WHO, even calling COVID-19, was trying to do, which was to remove it a bit from China and say it is a pandemic and it is a global issue. And in fact, we want to get through this. We're going to have because as we know, once a pandemic like this spreads, the only way to make sure that your country doesn't have another terrible wave is that all countries share information about where they're at, what their travel restrictions might be. Are they able to identify people who might have immunity? All of that actually suggests you need more global cooperation, not less. But at the same time, I think there's going to be huge economic damage from this pandemic. And anytime that happens, there's going to be a lot of looking around for, who's responsible. And, let's not mince words here. The world economy is probably in recession and it could get worse. So I would expect more of this, why did this happen, to continue in the coming months.
Yeah, Judah Grunstein, it's a cataclysm from what you've seen that's being blamed more on China, globalization, the national authorities in many of the Western countries, or on a virus, on science?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a public health element and there's a political element. The virus is obviously apolitical. How human societies respond to it is always political, whether no matter what the natural catastrophe is. I think with regard to the United States and the federal government's reaction, I think what's so upsetting, unsettling, and frustrating for Americans, people who are sympathetic to America, or people who count on American leadership or expect it, is that this is a world historical event, a world historical crisis, unprecedented in our lifetimes, and one that obviously is going to change the path of human history. And the United States is approaching it and addressing it and meeting it with the B team in the White House in Washington. And I think that that's an objective statement, not a partisan political statement. And what's important to underline in terms of the democratic system in the U.S. is that was a choice by American voters. It was a choice to essentially shed state capacity in the federal government. I don't think in the counterfactual, whether it was another administration in office, that necessarily you would have had a more effective response. There was a lot of human nature on display in Paris, for instance, when Italy was going through the worst of its crisis, and in Paris, people couldn't stay indoors when the temperature got nice at the beginning of the shutdown, which resulted in a much more strict isolation. So there's a lot of human behavior that's involved. There's no guarantee that another administration would necessarily have done better in convincing people. I think there would have been more preparedness. I think there would have been more leadership in terms of trying to immediately generate some sort of collective response, because the fact is, again, getting back to the politics of it, the virus does not respect borders. At this point, what we're seeing at various time delays is that we are all going through the exact same thing to various degrees based on responses. There are certain countries that a lot of us are envious of and would wish we were living there, like South Korea or Canada.
Judah,
but we need to address this collectively. And in the absence of a collective response, the plane loads of Chinese aid to Africa, the absence of American aid, things like that, those will go into political messaging. But in terms of an effective response, what is required urgently is a collective response. Collective response at
a supranational level, if you will. Has the United States lost its status as the go-to superpower in a crisis?
I think that I would say that lost definitively might be premature. I think this administration is seriously, if not fatally, compromised to be the one to do it. It's not in their DNA. It's not their instinct. They're hostile to the organizations that you would need to turn to do it. So it is a very frightening scenario where on that multilateral level, whether it's the UN, the G20, or other organizations that could step in, or that could be a forum for reaching collective decisions and mobilizing sequential aid to, for instance, Africa, which is going to be the next continent up, facing the peak, as certain countries exit from the peak, being able to mobilize and airlift some of the things like ventilators and supplies and protective equipment to the countries that become hotspots, and have a forum for communicating, for arriving at collective decisions that transcend national boundaries and national borders, because certainly the virus is not respecting those borders.
Eric Olander, you heard Linda Yueh say, we could be staring at a huge economic downturn that could last a long, long time. We have in the past century 2 examples of where this led to World War, and World War II followed the Great Depression. But could this actually be more like World War I, in that we know who the superpowers are going into this crisis? We don't know who the superpowers will be coming out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said, we're staring into the abyss. And I think there's some wisdom to that. We just don't know how far this is going to go. I tend to agree with Linda in the sense that so long as we don't have a vaccine, there's no security whatsoever. And that will take 12 to 18 months. I mean, I just see here in Vietnam, businesses are closing everywhere. I mean, shop owners are just not able to even wherewithal, so they just basically shut shop, and that's it. It's over. This is happening all over the world, and we've never been in this situation before. And I think we need a certain degree of humility in terms of forecasting, because it is going to be worse than we. Let's consider the fact that developing countries and highly indebted countries, particularly in South America, South Asia, and in Africa, are going to get hit even harder. So what we're seeing is that in the United States, the poor are going to suffer far more, and globally, the poor are going to suffer far more. And so I think that this is going to affect different countries differently and different regions differently, and that's something we also need to take into account. We're going into a depression, I think, the likes that history has not seen in the modern era. And it's hard to overstate the severity of what's happening, given the fact that we've never shut down the global economy at one time. And
Eric,
so,
Eric, we saw in 1945 the setting up of all these institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, precisely for this kind of crisis.
The problem is, though, is that we have a very disunited world, in the sense that the United States and China, as the two leading powers in the world, are certainly not going to sit across the table from one another to cooperate. I mean, given the rhetoric that both are hurling at each other, the amount of distrust that exists between the United States, a lot of China watchers in Washington, very, very respected guys who've been around for a very long time, say that we're at the edge of a precipice right now in U.S.-China relations. If those two countries can't actually get together to do something, those international institutions, I think, are disempowered. I mean, look what's happening with the WHO. If the United States decides to withhold that funding, and I think an advisor might have gotten to President Trump, the Chinese would backfill that spending in a second. The Chinese are fighting for influence bitterly in the United Nations, at the mid-level, at Food and Agriculture Organization, at the IP organization. They're fighting at every level for influence on these different things. This is not an environment where the United States and China are going to collaborate. At the end of the day, I don't believe that these multilateral institutions are up for the challenge. When we're talking about debt relief in Africa, it used to be that it was the IMF and the World Bank who were in the Paris Club who were the big players. Now it's the Eurobond holders or China, people outside of the traditional legacy donors. So we don't have a single place to go to solve a lot of these problems that the pandemic is creating.
All right, I'm hoping we don't conclude by leaving the glass half empty. So I'm going to leave it up to you, Linda. Do you agree with Eric Olander? And corollary question, where does that leave us here in Europe?
Yeah, you've asked an economist to conclude, and so I'm going to try not to be all about it. But I think, yes, this pandemic poses a real serious challenge to multilateral institutions, a number of whom were already under pressure because of the rise of the great powers. And as we know, the stakeholding in those institutions were really determined by the victors of World War II. So the shift that we see already has put a lot of stress, not just for that reason, but just because the world is very different in the 21st century. So a lot of organizations like the WTO, even the World Bank and IMF were struggling anyways. And I think the frustrations with them is perhaps, one of the things that's been with us. And with the pandemic, I think it's just highlighted the need to look at, for instance, how you can do debt relief in developing countries through these institutions beyond just calling for it. All of these are absolutely the kinds of challenges that could actually make institutions stronger. So if there's been this period of skepticism about these global institutions, this is actually the opportunity to try and remake them. Now, I make the same argument for Europe. So as we know, as we speak, the European Union is debating whether or not to have more coordinated response to the pandemic, discussions of corona bonds, joint debt issuance through the Eurozone by the Eurozone countries, or some type of COVID-19 credit line through the European Stability Mechanism. All of these discussions, the pandemic has essentially revived discussions, which are already happening.
You're polite to call them discussions. The finance ministers who've been meeting virtually the last 24 hours. It sounds more like a fractious argument.
Yeah, I think the Eurozone is known for that a bit. But I think I'm stressing that these discussions in the Eurozone have been going on since the Euro crisis from 10 years ago, which is, do you need more of a pan-European type of response? And whether that's on the fiscal front or whether that's on, some type of joint debt to support, businesses and people. And again, the pandemic offers an opportunity to think about how you can strengthen institutions, which, even though we know there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around this pandemic, there are certain things we know that need to be done, and it requires cooperation to do it. So the first thing is strengthening public health system, removing things like trade restrictions on PPE equipment or high tariffs too. We need to support people. So if some European countries do not have enough fiscal space to do that, then maybe they need more help. Otherwise, you risk turning a recession into something worse, possibly a depression. And then finally, you need to support businesses. And in Europe, businesses are pan-European. So if you want to support viable businesses, then I think there is, again, an argument to look at the institution. So I guess I would conclude with saying the pandemic is unlike anything that we have seen in recent memory. The economic consequences will be absolutely severe. We've talked about the geopolitical implications, but I would say, is this an opportunity to strengthen the very institutions that we need to be better equipped for the 21st century? So
a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Linda Yueh, I want to thank you so much for being with us. I want to thank as well Eric Olander in Vietnam, Judah Grunstein of World Politics Review. Thank you for joining us here in this confined edition of the France 24 debate. And thank you especially for joining us in ever greater numbers and for sharing on social media, Facebook, YouTube, and your platform of choice. There's more, by the way, on our website, france24.com.